Sophie Chen was late at IT wasn't anything new, really. Late was her constant state of being, like a permanent feature in the architecture of her life. She was always late for meetings, late for coffee dates, late for her own reflection in the bathroom mirror. Today, though, she wasn't just late. She was really late, and the universe seemed to know it. As she sprinted out of her apartment building, the heel of her left shoe snapped off, sending her lurching forward onto the sidewalk like a drunken giraffe. She swore loudly, the sound bouncing off the walls of the narrow alley between her building and the cafe on the corner. Sophie took a deep breath, straightened up, and stood still for a moment, willing the universe to cut her some slack for once. Really? Really? She muttered to no one in particular. A woman in a business suit passed by, casting her a curious glance. Sophie shot her a glare, which the woman returned with a smile that was just a little too bright, like someone who might be on the verge of starting an inspirational podcast. Sophie hated those kinds of smiles. The ones that made you feel like you needed to improve your life just by existing in the same space as them. Well, look at that, Sophie said under her breath as she hobbled towards the nearest crosswalk. First, my heel, now that. She reached the sidewalk, ignoring the tiny sense of déjà vu that seemed to tug at her. Something about the way the woman in the suit smiled felt almost off. But it was too fleeting to focus on. Sophie turned the corner and walked into her favorite coffee shop, the one where she was pretty sure the barista had memorized her coffee order by now. Regular, extra hot, no foam, large, Sophie said, her voice carrying more than usual in the half-empty room. The barista, a guy named Tom, glanced up at her and nodded. You got it, Sophie. Sophie sat down at the corner table by the window, the same one she always took. She pulled out her phone and scrolled aimlessly through her notifications. A message from Alex, her best friend, popped up. Hey, are we still on for tonight? Sophie smiled. Alex was the only person who could turn a Thursday night into a memorable event, even if it was just ordering Thai food and watching terrible movies. She quickly typed back, yep, dinner at 7, then, something caught her eye, on her social media feed, a post that seemed strangely familiar. It was from her account, but Sophie couldn't remember posting anything recently. The photo was one of her usual artsy shots of her morning coffee, nothing spectacular. The caption, though, was something she'd definitely never written: another day of pretending to be something I'm not. Cheers to the endless game of self-deception. She stared at it. What was that supposed to mean? Sophie didn't pretend to be anything. She was honest to a fault, even if it meant sometimes being brutally sarcastic. So why did this post sound like something someone else would write? Sophie. Tom's voice broke her out of her thoughts. She looked up to see him holding her coffee, a slightly confused look on his face. You okay? You look like you just saw a ghost. Sophie blinked at him, then at the coffee in his hands. The cup had her usual name written on it, Sophie, of course, but it seemed a little too perfect, almost like it had been printed by a machine designed to make everything just right. Yeah, I'm fine, Sophie replied, forcing a smile. Just tired. Thanks. Tom didn't seem convinced but nodded, backing off with a quick, let me know if you need anything. As Sophie picked up the cup, she felt a strange wave of unease ripple through her. It wasn't the coffee shop or the weird post. It was something more fundamental. Something was off with the world around her, as if reality itself had started to twist, just slightly, enough to make her question everything. Later that evening, the unease crept back in. Sophie was at home, scrolling through her Instagram again, when the feeling intensified. There were new posts on her feed, pictures, updates, even stories. Each one looked just like something Sophie herself might post, except she didn't post any of them. It was like someone had hacked into her account, but she'd checked the security settings earlier, and everything was secure. She wasn't hacked. No, this felt different. This felt personal. Sophie tapped on one of the photos. It was a shot of her apartment, taken from the corner she always sat in while working, the sunlight slanting across the couch in that exact way she liked it. The caption was simple, just me, thinking about how much I've changed. She felt the blood drain from her face. She didn't even think that thought, let alone post it. Sophie didn't spend her time reflecting on how much she'd changed. She didn't care about change. It was the little details that mattered to her. The design of her apartment, the feel of a good cup of coffee, the songs she liked, the weird people she'd meet in a city like this. Change was for other people, not her, but here it was. A version of herself. Someone pretending to be her, but not quite getting it right. The thought was absurd. Someone had to be messing with her, right? Maybe it was one of her friends, trying to get a laugh out of her. But then why did it feel so real? Why did it feel like whoever had done this was inside her head, scraping the surface of everything she thought she knew about herself? Sophie stared at the screen, trying to shake the feeling. She had to be imagining it. She couldn't let something as trivial as a weird post spiral her into a full-blown existential crisis. Then, just as she was about to shut off her phone and go to bed, she got a message. It was from her coworker, Janet, who was supposed to meet her the next day for a design critique. "Hey, I loved your post on social media last night. Are you still coming to the meeting tomorrow? I'm excited to see what you'll bring." Sophie's stomach dropped. She hadn't posted anything. Had she? By now, Sophie couldn't ignore the growing sense that someone, was trying to be her. The sensation was like a slow unraveling of her own identity. She had to get to the bottom of this. But how? The next morning, things got even stranger. Sophie was running late again, naturally. She rushed through her apartment door, practically running into her neighbor, who stood in the hallway holding a cup of coffee. "Oh, hey," the woman said brightly, a little too brightly. "You're Sophie Chen, right?" Sophie froze for a moment. Of course, she was Sophie Chen. Everyone knew that, but then, the woman continued, "I saw your social media post last night. Wow, it really spoke to me. You're a deep thinker." Sophie blinked at her. What post?" "Oh, you know, the one where you were talking about the soul's need to evolve and be free?" The woman smiled, a little too wide for comfort. "It really made me reflect on my life, you know. I've been feeling the same way." Sophie could only stare at her, the words rattling around in her head. "I didn't post anything like that," Sophie said, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. The woman tilted her head, smiling in that unnervingly perfect way again. "Of course you did. It's all over your feed." Sophie's stomach twisted as the world around her seemed to bend in ways it shouldn't have. She wasn't crazy. Something, was trying to replace her. She just didn't know who, or why. Sophie backed away from her neighbor, the eerie smile still lingering on the woman's face. Her feet felt like they were glued to the floor as a cold dread settled in the pit of her stomach. She had to shake this off. She had to. Her mind was spinning, and the rational part of her brain was trying desperately to regain control. "You're just tired, Sophie. Maybe you're just overthinking things," but deep down, she knew it wasn't just that. She could feel it now, a creeping sensation that something about her world had gone wrong. And it wasn't just the strange social media posts or the weird run-ins with people she'd never met. It was her, the real her, that seemed to be slipping through her fingers, like sand on a beach. The person she thought she was beginning to fray around the edges. The world she'd lived in, the one that felt familiar and concrete, was starting to warp, stretch, and distort. She turned away from her neighbor and practically fled down the stairs. Outside, the air was too cold for early spring, a biting wind blowing through the empty streets. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself, but it didn't help. The cold wasn't just physical. It was existential, like everything she knew was unraveling and she had no control over it. Sophie's phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out without thinking. It was another message from Alex. "Are you coming over soon? I found a movie that's so bad it's good. We should be done with dinner by 7. I'll make the reservations, don't worry." For a moment, Sophie considered texting back. She was supposed to meet him at 7, but this, whatever this was, had to be dealt with. The feeling gnawed at her. The sense of something being off, like a bad smell lingering in the air, wouldn't leave her. She needed answers. She needed to talk to someone who could make sense of this. She dialed Alex's number, holding her breath as it rang. "Hey, Sophie, what's up?" Alex's voice was light, casual. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice shaking. "Like, seriously?" "Whoa. Okay, what's going on?" There was an edge of concern in Alex's voice now. "I think something's wrong with me," she blurted out. "Like, I'm not the only one here." She could feel her heart race as she spoke. "I keep seeing copies of myself. People who look like me, but they're not me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Sophie closed her eyes, waiting for Alex's usual skeptical laugh, the one that always made her feel a little less insane. Instead, he said, "I'm coming over." "Stay put." Sophie nodded, though she knew he couldn't see her. She hung up the phone and walked the streets aimlessly, trying to calm her thoughts. There was a tightness in her chest now, like the world had shifted on its axis, and she wasn't sure if she was supposed to be part of it anymore. It wasn't long before Alex showed up at her apartment, his usual disheveled self, dark hoodie, messy hair, and a look on his face that was a mixture of confusion and concern. "Sophie, this sounds insane," Alex said as he stepped inside. "But I trust you. What the hell is going on?" Sophie didn't want to go over the details again. She just needed him to believe her. She felt like she was drowning in a sea of questions with no way to keep her head above water. "I don't know," she said, her voice low, barely a whisper. "But I keep running into these versions of me. Not just the people who look like me, but they know things. Things I've never told anyone." Alex's brows furrowed. "Are you sure it's not just—" "I don't know, exhaustion? Stress? You've been working a lot." "I thought it was just stress at first, too. But it's not. It's like I'm being replaced," Sophie said, pacing now. "Like there's someone out there who wants my life, my identity. I don't know why, but it's like they're getting in my head. Like they're trying to erase me." Alex's eyes narrowed. Okay. But why do you think they're trying to replace you? I mean, you said they know personal stuff about you, but how are they acting?" Sophie stopped pacing and turned to face him. "It's not just knowing stuff. It's how they act. Some of them are more confident than me, some are way more outgoing, some are even kinder than I am, in a fake, over-the-top way. It's like they're trying to take over my life, my job, my friends, everything." Alex ran a hand through his hair. "Okay. So these replicants, are they trying to be you in your social media? In your job?" "Yeah," Sophie said, sitting down at her kitchen table, hands shaking. "They've been posting from my account. They've been showing up at my favorite spots. It's like someone is playing a game where they're me, and I'm just not. I don't know what they want or why they're doing it." Alex crossed the room and sat down across from her. He was silent for a moment, considering. "This sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie." "Are you sure you're not? I'm not imagining it." Sophie cut him off, her voice tight with frustration. "I've been dealing with this for days now, Alex. And it's getting worse." There was a long pause, and then Alex sighed. Okay. Let's try to figure this out. Let's start with one thing. How do you know they're from a different dimension, or whatever? It's not just weird coincidences." Sophie shook her head. "It's the way they act. They're not me. They're playing a role. They're like copies of a copy, and it's getting messier every day." Alex stood up and walked over to the window, staring out at the city below. He didn't speak for a few minutes, just thinking. Sophie sat still, waiting, too afraid to move. She felt like her life had become something unrecognizable, a movie that had taken a dark turn, and she had no idea how to change the script. Finally, Alex turned around. "I think I might know someone who can help," he said, a grim look on his face. Sophie looked up at him, eyes wide. "Who?" "A physicist. She's into all kinds of weird stuff, like alternate dimensions, parallel worlds, things that sound insane, but she's been working on some theories. If anyone can help figure this out, it's her." Sophie didn't know if she should feel relieved or even more frightened. But she didn't care anymore. She was willing to try anything. "Let's go," she said, her voice resolute. Doctor. Fiona Lyle's office was tucked away in a small building on the edge of the city, the kind of place that looked unremarkable from the outside but held the kind of secrets Sophie was desperate to uncover. When they arrived, the door was slightly ajar, and Sophie had the unsettling feeling that they weren't the only ones who had been there. The office was filled with books on quantum physics, theorems about multidimensional spaces, and papers scattered across the desk in chaotic disarray. Dr. Lyle was sitting behind her desk when they entered, her eyes sharp and calculating. "Alex." "Sophie," she said, her tone not unfriendly but precise. "I've been expecting you." Sophie blinked. "You've been expecting us?" "Indeed," Dr. Lyle replied, her gaze steady. "What you're experiencing isn't a coincidence. It's a result of something far more complex. A tear in the fabric of our reality." Sophie's heart raced. "Tear in reality?" Dr. Lyle nodded, pushing a thick stack of papers aside. "You're seeing what I call dimensional bleed. These copies of you are reflections from parallel worlds. They're not quite the same, but they're close enough. Someone, or something, has destabilized the barriers between dimensions. And it's only a matter of time before it completely collapses." Sophie felt like the ground had fallen away beneath her. "So these people are from other realities?" "Exactly," Dr. Lyle said, her eyes narrowing. "And they're trying to replace you. They think they can take your place. They're not just mimicking you. They're trying to rewrite your life." Sophie felt the weight of her world crashing down on her. "How do I stop them?" she asked, barely able to breathe. Doctor. Lyle stared at her, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You don't. At least, not in the way you think." Dr. Lyle's words hung in the air, heavy with a kind of finality that made Sophie's skin crawl. "You don't," she repeated, her voice soft but firm. "Not in the way you think." Sophie's heart thudded in her chest. "What does that mean? What are you saying?" The physicist leaned back in her chair, folding her hands together in front of her. Her eyes seemed to pierce through Sophie, as if she could see everything, the fear, the confusion, and the desperate need for an answer. "The reality you think you're experiencing is not as solid as you believe. It's fractured. You're not just seeing copies of yourself, Sophie. You're seeing the result of an entire network of converging dimensions." Sophie's mind scrambled to make sense of what Dr. Lyle was saying, but it felt like trying to solve a puzzle where all the pieces were just out of reach. "So these copies, they're not real? Or are they real? How do I know what's real anymore?" "They are real," Dr. Lyle replied, leaning forward now. "Just not in the way you understand. They exist in alternate dimensions, parallel realities, where the rules of time, space, and identity are slightly different. You're experiencing what I call a dimensional bleed. The fabric of your world is thin, and these parallel versions of you are beginning to overlap. They're bleeding through, like water seeping through cracks in a wall." Sophie felt a chill run down her spine as she tried to digest the explanation. "So they're not just pretending to be me, they're actually me?" Her voice cracked on the last word, as if saying it out loud made it all the more terrifying. "They are versions of you," Dr. Lyle said slowly. "But they're not you in the truest sense. They are fragments of the person you could have been if different choices had been made, or if the circumstances of your life had shifted in small, imperceptible ways. In some dimensions, you're more confident. In others, you're a completely different person. And some of them, they don't even know they're a copy. They think they are you, but they're not. Sophie ran a hand through her hair, pacing now. And they're trying to replace me. Take my life. Yes, Dr. Lyle confirmed, her voice cold and clinical. They are trying to occupy your place in this world. They see it as an opportunity. A chance to live as you, because in their reality, they may not have the life you've built. Some of them might even think they're doing you a favor, by removing you from the picture entirely. Sophie's throat tightened, the words barely forming. But why me? Why not someone else? Why is this happening to me? Dr. Lyle didn't answer right away. Her expression darkened, and Sophie could see the weight of the knowledge that had been burdening her for who knew how long. I can't say for sure, Sophie. But I've seen this before. It's not just random. Something, or someone, is destabilizing the barriers between these dimensions. Someone is orchestrating this. Sophie felt her stomach twist. So you think someone's behind this? Someone wants this to happen? Dr. Lyle nodded slowly. I believe so. This isn't just a natural occurrence. Whoever is causing this is manipulating the fabric of reality for their own reasons. And if we don't stop it soon, these overlaps will only become more frequent. You won't be able to tell who's real anymore. You won't even be able to trust yourself. Sophie's pulse quickened, a cold sweat forming on her brow. How do I stop it? That's the problem, Dr. Lyle said, her voice tightening. There's no simple fix. This is something beyond physics, beyond anything I've ever encountered. But I have a theory. It's radical, untested. But you're running out of time. Sophie felt a sinking sensation. What is it? Dr. Lyle stood up from her desk and walked to a filing cabinet at the far side of the room. She pulled out a thick folder and dropped it onto the desk in front of Sophie. There's a way to restore the dimensional balance. But it requires a sacrifice. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Sacrifice? What kind of sacrifice? Dr. Lyle met her gaze. You'll need to sever the link between you and the alternate versions of yourself. You will have to make a choice. Either you reinforce the boundaries of your own existence, which will erase every other version of you from these realities, or you will allow the collapse to continue. The bleed will worsen, and eventually, these copies will overwhelm you, leaving you with nothing. No identity, no life. Sophie's head spun. She couldn't understand it. She'd never thought of herself as someone capable of making such a decision. The idea of erasing these versions of herself, people who, in some way, were still her, felt impossible. But to allow everything to collapse? That was even worse. I don't know if I can do that, Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. You don't have a choice, Dr. Lyle said softly, but firmly. Not if you want to preserve yourself. If you don't act now, you'll lose everything. For the next few days, Sophie didn't sleep. Every night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the impossible decision she faced. Should she sacrifice these other versions of herself? These reflections of who she might have been in different realities? The thought of doing that, it felt like a betrayal of who she was. Yet, if she didn't act, they would take over. She'd lose her life. She'd lose her place in the world. On the fourth night, as the hours stretched on and she found herself staring at the reflection in her bedroom mirror, Sophie realized she wasn't alone. There was someone behind her, someone she couldn't see, but she knew was there. The faint sound of footsteps echoed behind her, almost too quiet to hear, but enough to make her blood run cold. Sophie, a voice whispered from the darkness. Sophie froze, unable to turn around. Her heart pounded, and her breath came in short, sharp bursts. She knew that voice. She recognized it. It was her voice, but wrong. Too smooth. Too perfect. You don't have to do this, the voice continued. We don't have to fight. We can share this world. We can be together. Sophie's hands trembled as she reached for the light switch. The room illuminated, and she turned quickly, her eyes scanning the shadows. But there was no one there, nothing. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, but it wasn't her reflection anymore. It was another version of herself, someone who stood tall, confident, and utterly unafraid. Sophie's own face stared back at her, a cold, perfect replica of the woman she might have been if she'd made different choices. The eyes were the same, but the expression, that wasn't her. You can't stop us, the reflection whispered, as if it could read Sophie's thoughts. We're all part of you. You'll never get rid of us. Sophie stumbled backward, a rush of fear flooding her senses. She grabbed her phone and called Alex, her hands shaking too violently to type a message. The phone rang, but he didn't pick up. Her reflection smiled, and that's when Sophie knew she wasn't just fighting to save her life. She was fighting for her soul. She closed her eyes and exhaled slowly, steadying herself. There was no time left to second guess. If she didn't act now, if she didn't make the choice that Dr. Lyle had warned her about, she wouldn't have anything left to fight for, and she wasn't about to let some other version of herself take over her world. The phone rang again. This time, Alex answered. Sophie? What's going on? He said, his voice thick with concern. I'm doing it, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. I'm ending it. For good. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Alex said, Be careful, sophomore. Please. Sophie didn't respond. Instead, she stood up, holding her phone tightly in her hand, her heart racing. The room around her seemed to fade, and she knew, deep down, that when she made this choice, nothing would ever be the same again. It wasn't just about saving herself anymore. It was about making sure that no one else would ever be her again. With a final breath, Sophie reached out, ready to sever the link.